The United States' support of the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista led to the hostilities between the two nations in the Cold War era. Pre-revolution, Havana was a growing city. The sale of sugar to the U.S. was good for the city's economy. Cuba ranked high in the Western Hemisphere for per capita income, life expectancy, and literacy rate, which was 76%. Cuba had a relatively good income distribution as compared to its neighboring countries. They also had a thriving middle class. However, not all Cubans were part of the thriving middle class. There was severe poverty for some in the rural areas. There was poor education and health care for this class of people. In addition, there was racism prevalent throughout Cuban society. At the same time as all of this, Cuba experienced political issues as well. While Cuba did have a democracy with free elections for years, there was still corruption in the government. In 1952, a leader named Fulgencio Batista had seized full control of the government. The Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara were communist revolutionaries who worked to overthrow Batista's regime. Meanwhile, the tensions between the U.S. and the Communist Soviet Union were growing. Fearing for its investments in Cuba and the proximity to the island, the United States backed Batista during this time. However, Cuban support grew for Castro because of corruption under Batista and because of Castro's charisma. Eventually, due to the rampant brutality of Batista's government, the U.S. eventually stopped supporting Batista. In 1959, Castro and his followers had seized control of the Cuban government. Castro allied Cuba with the Soviet Union and took control of American-owned property in Cuba. As a result, the U.S. enacted a trade and travel embargo on Cuba.
The Bay of Pigs invasion. This was in 1959 when the U.S. attempted to overthrow the dictatorial leader Fulgencio Batista. This was because Cuba was a communist government, and this time period was during the Cold War, when it was a battle between which government each side thought was right, between communist and a democracy. This dictatorial leader considered himself pro-American. The U.S. owned more than half of Cuba's sugar plantations during this time. This invasion was a failed attack, and then due to this, Cuba sought help from the USSR. Cuban Missile Crisis. This is when the USSR was secretly deploying missiles to Cuba. They secretly deployed the missiles for protection and to counteract U.S. missiles in case of attack. Because of this, it led to a 13-day political as well as military standoff. The U.S. originally planned an airstrike on their nuclear sites in 1962, but it never ended up happening. Kennedy chose a more careful approach and announced interception of all Cuba's imports as a new way to fight the threat. Russia chose to supply the missiles to Cuba because they were within range of the U.S., and during this time the U.S. and the Soviets had tension. Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev offered to remove missiles from Cuba if the U.S. promised not to attack Cuba. Kennedy also secretly promised to remove missiles from Turkey so that both main powerhouse countries were not within range to strike. This was the closest any two countries have been in nuclear contact. This was the most important confrontation in the Cold War. Russia claimed that when the U.S. decided to block all imports of Cuba, it was an act of war because of a restriction of international waters as well as air. Effect of Cuba on the Cold War. Economically, there was the Soviet Union alliance. This is when the Soviets supplied Cuba with financial as well as military aid. Politically, there was the Rio Treaty. This treaty united Cuba, the United States, and other neighboring countries to defend areas from external attack before the Cold War began. And then the U.S. ends diplomatic relations as they prepared to take extreme measures against Castro's regime. There was also the Operation Mongoose. This was similar to the Bay of Pigs, and the goal was to get rid of the communist power. And another political effect was the Havana Declaration. This is when Castro declared to prioritize national independence, sovereignty. Culturally, there was a Cuban Revolution. This was an armed revolt that was conducted by Fidel Castro against the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista in 1959, and it was a way to replace the past government and implement the communist system.